Okay, let's try and unpack this. You've sent over some really interesting material. And the first thing that jumps out is this big contrast, this duality between public and private domains.
Mhm.
It almost feels like one is about, appearances, carefully managed process, maybe overshadowing reality.
That's a good way to put it. While the other seems to aim for something more solid, more
Yeah.
accountable.
Right. And for you listening, if you want to get to the core of things quickly, avoid getting bogged down, this deep dive should help. We're aiming to pull out those key distinctions from your sources efficiently.
Exactly. We're not trying to drown in jargon here. The idea is to get the main principles of commercial activity, at least as they're presented in the text you sent.
Which includes a quiz, vocabulary, a glossary, lots of definitions.
Yeah, quite comprehensive. So our mission really is to connect these dots, focus on this public versus private thing, and see what it means for liability, judges, how disputes get settled.
And even some of the newer tech and finance stuff mentioned, right?
Precisely. We'll stick closely to your materials to keep it, clear and grounded in what you provided.
Great. So let's start with the basics. This public domain. Your sources list 4 main attributes. First up, illusion, described as form without substance. What's a key takeaway there? Like, what does that imply?
Well, what's interesting is that in this public domain, the emphasis often seems to be on following the rules, the statutory law, the form.
Okay.
Even if the underlying truth, the sort of verifiable facts, the substance,
Yeah.
maybe aren't the main focus of how it operates day to day.
Like a performance.
Yeah.
Where hitting your marks is key.
That's not a bad analogy, actually. The execution of the script, the procedure, can be paramount. And this idea of form without substance, it really affects everything else in that domain. It has these ripple effects.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. And that links to the second attribute you mentioned, limited liability. How does that fit with the illusion idea?
Well, if you think about the bigger picture, limited liability means you can participate in this public domain without carrying, let's say, the full personal weight of the outcomes.
Right, because the domain itself is kind of a construct.
Exactly. It's a legal framework, maybe even an agreed-upon fiction in some ways, based on these sources. So the consequences can be contained within an entity or shifted.
Which is very different from what we'll see in the private domain, I gather.
Oh, completely different. It really raises questions about where true responsibility ultimately lands, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Which leads perfectly into the third attribute, irresponsibility. That's quite a strong word.
It is strong, yeah. But it's used, I think, to draw a sharp contrast. If you have limited liability within a system where form can trump substance, then that direct link between your actions and the final consequences, that sense of full responsibility, it can get a bit diluted.
So people or companies might act within the rules of this illusion?
Without necessarily shouldering the full, say, moral or financial weight of what happens?
Okay, so it's layering up. Illusion leading to limited liability, which can foster this irresponsibility. And the fourth piece, the public domain operates under statutory law with reliance on opinion, presumption, and testimony. Why is that so important?
Well, that really gets to the foundation of how decisions get made. Opinion, presumption, testimony. These are inherently subjective things.
Open to debate.
Exactly. Open to interpretation, argument. It's a stark contrast to the private domain's ideal, which emphasizes facts and stipulations without controversy.
Right.
And statutory law itself, well, it's created by humans, interpreted by humans. So naturally, different views and arguments arise and can influence outcomes.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so switching gears slightly, but staying with this contrast.
Right.
Liability. The sources draw a very clear line. Public domain, as we said, limited, maybe shifted around. Private domain, it says full liability tied to responsibility and sovereignty. That sounds like a completely different way of thinking about accountability.
It's fundamental, absolutely. In the private domain concept, the individual is seen almost as well as sovereign, fully accountable for their actions, their agreements, their debts.
So responsibility is a direct counterpoint to the irresponsibility potential in the public domain.
Precisely. And this idea of sovereignty connects to terms like allodial estate.
Aye, that was in the glossary. What does that signify?
It signifies absolute ownership, ultimate ownership, free from any higher claims. You own it outright.
Okay.
The sources also bring up a more Moorish estate in a similar vein, representing this idea of inherent sovereign rights, ownership tied perhaps to heritage, again emphasizing that direct link. Individual, responsibility, ownership.
Ultimate control, ultimate accountability.
You got it. That's the essence. If you're operating privately in this framework, you're fully on the hook, but you also have that higher degree of autonomy that comes with real ownership.
Like the allodial estate idea embodies that.
Exactly. That principles of ultimate authority and the responsibility that naturally follows.
Okay. Now, how do disagreements get handled differently? And the judge's role. In the private domain, the sources say a judge acts in a ministerial capacity. What does that mean, practically?
Ministerial capacity essentially means the judge's role is more administrative, procedural.
Less about deciding who's right or wrong.
Pretty much. Because, ideally, interactions in the private domain are based on stipulations and agreements. The sources call it a fact-based, non-controversial approach.
So the facts are already agreed upon.
Right. So there shouldn't be a substantive dispute, a controversy, in theory. The judge is mainly there to make sure those agreed-upon facts and terms are honored. Minimal room for their own opinion or broad rulings. It's about enforcing what the parties already said was true.
Okay, whereas in the public domain, disputes arise through argument. That word seems key. And it introduces controversy. How does that change the judge's position?
Controversy is the game changer. Once you have parties making opposing argument.
Then the judge has to step in and decide.
Exactly. They have to weigh the arguments, look at the relevant statutes, interpret them, and make a binding decision. That gives the judge much more discretion, much more power in that situation.
And the sources mentioned they get legal immunity in that context, too.
Yes. According to the material, because they're operating within that framework of contested arguments and interpreting the law, they're granted that immunity.
So it's like public domain judge is an umpire calling balls and strikes in a contested game. Private domain judge is more like a referee making sure the rules of a pre-agreed process are followed.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah. The nature of the interaction argument versus agreement really defines the judge's role and authority.
Interesting. Now, the sources introduce some modern tools, too, like standard debt obligations, SDOs. What's the goal behind these? How do they fit in?
SDOs are fascinating. It seems like an attempt to bring some of that clarity and maybe enforceability we associate with the private domain into a broader system. They're described as legally structured, blockchain-verifiable debt instruments. The idea is to make enforcing debt easier across different legal systems, different countries, foreign jurisdictions.
And the blockchain part gives transparency.
Transparency and an immutable record, publicly auditable proof of the debt.
And what about this dual recording concept? Recording it on a blockchain and a traditional legal registry? Why both?
Well, think of dual recording as building a bridge. You're connecting the innovation of blockchain, its transparency, its cryptographic security, with the established power and recognition of existing legal systems. The traditional registry gives it that official legal standing, making it enforceable through courts.
So you get the best of both worlds, tech certainty and legal teeth.
That seems to be the goal, yes. Leveraging the strengths of both the digital and the traditional legal worlds. It's quite strategic.
Yeah, it sounds it. The sources also drop terms like secure bank box and programmable financial law trust near SDOs. What are those hitting at?
The secure bank box sounds like a concept for a platform, probably using blockchain and built-in compliance tools for managing and enforcing digital assets like these SDOs securely.
Okay.
And programmable financial law trust. Well, that's even more forward-looking. It suggests encoding legal agreements, maybe even trust structures, directly into code into smart contracts on a blockchain.
So the agreements could enforce themselves automatically?
Potentially, yeah, based on coded conditions. Imagine legal terms executing themselves. Highly transparent, highly immutable. It could really change things.
Wow, okay. That is transformative. Now, another role player mentioned, the notary public. We usually think of them for, stamping documents, but the text gives them a bigger role, especially privately.
It does seem to elevate the role, yes. 3 key functions are highlighted. First, attesting to the truth and authenticity of documents that formal verifications.
Standard stuff.
Pretty standard, yes.
Yeah.
Second, certifying signatures and official acts confirming who's who. Also familiar. But third, and this seems key in the context, they can serve as a second witness to authenticate private processes in commercial law, like a neutral third party ensuring the integrity of private agreements.
So reinforcing the validity of those private domain interactions.
Exactly. It ties into terms like attestation and jurat, those formal declarations of truth made before the notary.
And there's something about a notary chain, a blockchain for notaries.
Yeah, that's mentioned too. A potential blockchain network specifically for these notarized documents, which could massively boost security, make them easier to access and verify globally.
So the notary becomes this trusted human anchor point, verifying things, maybe even bridging the physical document world with a secure digital chain.
That's a great way to put it. They provide that human verification layer, which is still so crucial for trust and agreements.
Okay, let's loop back to arguing. In the public domain context, the sources say arguing puts you in dishonor. That sounds serious. What's the legal meaning there?
It does sound stark, doesn't it? Within the specific legal framework described, dishonor seems to mean being seen as legally untrustworthy or unreliable in the court process.
How so?
By arguing, you're basically accepting the court's authority to settle the controversy. You're playing the game, so to speak.
Ah,
And that puts you under the judge's discretion. Whereas, again, the ideal in the private domain is to avoid that whole adversarial setup by having clear, agreed-upon facts up front. No argument needed.
so arguing is essentially conceding there is a controversy for the judge to rule on.
That seems to be the implication in the sources, yes.
Yep.
Placing yourself within that discretionary power structure.
Got it. Now, a total shift, seemingly. Bitcoin mining and energy. The sources talk about creating digital energy from wasted or stranded energy. That sounds counterintuitive. Can you elaborate?
It does sound odd at first, yeah. But the idea is transforming potential that's currently lost into a digital asset.
Mm.
Creating digital energy refers to taking electricity that might otherwise be wasted, maybe because there's no demand nearby or no way to transmit it effectively, sometimes called stranded energy or idle electrons, and using that specific power for Bitcoin mining. This secures the Bitcoin network, obviously, but it also earns new Bitcoin as a reward.
Mhm.
So it's like creating this digital energy value from previously unusable electrical energy.
Interesting. So turning a waste product into something valuable. And how does this connect with AI's energy demands and this idea of mining as a dispatchable load for curtailment? That sounds complex.
It is interconnected, though. AI, especially the inference kind running everywhere, needs a lot of power,
Yeah.
often consistently.
Right.
But power grids have peaks and troughs. Bitcoin mining, because you can often turn the machines on or off relatively quickly,
Ah.
can act as a dispatchable load. So when the grid is stressed, maybe AI demand is high, miners can voluntarily cut back their power use. That's curtailment.
Freeing up power for other things.
Exactly. It helps balance the grid, helps data centers manage their power flow more efficiently. It's a kind of flexible demand.
And the tech involved. Things like ASICs, hash rate.
Yeah, specialized mining computers called ASICs, measured by their hash rate. And advanced cooling is crucial. Liquid immersion cooling is mentioned. We're also seeing companies becoming vertically integrated, controlling everything from power generation to mining, described as energy transformation companies.
And even a strategic Bitcoin reserve.
That idea is floated too, yes.
Yeah.
Like a national asset, potentially.
So far from just being an energy drain, mining could actually help manage the grid, especially with AI booming. That's unexpected.
It really challenges the simple narrative, doesn't it? It highlights potential synergies you wouldn't immediately think of. Quite a symbiotic relationship, potentially.
It really is. Okay, lastly, the sources briefly connect some of these ideas to broader things. DeFi, a legal rail, the UCC. How do these fit the big picture?
Well, zooming out, DeFi, decentralized finance, is all about building financial services on blockchains, often cutting out middlemen. Concepts like SDOs or programmable law could become building blocks for what the sources call a legal rail, basically, a compliant, secure blockchain infrastructure for finance.
Like tracks for digital finance to run on legally?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And mentioning JSON possibly becoming a negotiable instrument, hints at digitizing traditional finance tools. The UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code, especially Article 3 on negotiable instruments, would be the crucial legal backdrop for making that work.
And the distinction between consumers, public, and creditor-debtor, private.
Right, just highlighting that consumer law often operates under different assumptions and protections within the public domain framework compared to the private domain's focus on clearly defined creditor-debtor agreements and responsibilities.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are the absolute key takeaways for someone listening, trying to make sense of this public-private distinction?
I think the core difference boils down to liability and responsibility. The public domain, as described here, often involves limited liability, operates on process and statutes, and uses argument and judicial discretion for disputes.
Kind of like a managed system with built-in buffers.
You could say that. Whereas the private domain ideal emphasizes full liability, linked to individual sovereignty and responsibility, Interactions are meant to be based on clear, factual agreements, aiming to avoid disputes altogether.
Substance over form, ideally.
Exactly. And then you have these emerging technologies like blockchain, SDOs, even Bitcoin mining's energy role, potentially offering new ways to interact with or maybe even bridge these two domains, adding transparency, enforceability, maybe even efficiency.
Okay. So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. How might truly understanding these differences between the public and private domains concepts, often hidden in plain sight, actually empower you in your own business, your financial life, maybe even legal interactions?
And as we see things like blockchain becoming more integrated with traditional law, what are the ripple effects? What are the long-term, perhaps unforeseen consequences for how we handle contracts, money, and disagreements down the road?
Definitely a lot to think about. Hopefully, this deep dive has given you a solid framework and sparked some further thought and maybe even research based on all those terms and ideas we explored.